What is a Christian response to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II? Join me in this interview with Dr. Robert Joustra, professor of politics at Calvin University, where we dive into this and other thorny areas of international politics. We talk about what makes international politics extra challenging, historical Christian tools for thinking through these issues, and places in Scripture we can go to resource our thinking on the topic. If you like what you see and hear on the Biblical Mind podcast, why don't you like and subscribe? Or you can give us 5 stars. You could also give us a little, to the cause by going to thebiblicalmind.org/give if you're so inclined. But otherwise, please stay tuned for the show.
This is the Biblical Mind podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
So, you just came out with a new book, and it's fantastic. Reached out, wanted to have you on the podcast. Tell us a little bit about your background and what it is that you've written here.
Yeah, thank you. So I did manage to unbox a copy of it from our moving box today. So I'll hold it up for your viewers. It's Christ and Covenant in Global Politics, a Christian Introduction to International Relations. So I am a professor of politics here at Calvin University as of July 1st. But my interest kind of in this, in terms of especially thinking through the question of geopolitics, world politics, is a bit autobiographical. I was in my first year of college in September of 2001. And I thought that I would probably study history, and I did, for the record, because in some ways, I think that international relations is sort of almost a branch of applied history. But I realized that I also, 9/11 being kind of in that first week of class, and there were no smartphones dinging, there were no notifications going off. There was just, your buddy in the hall saying, you should go home and turn on the TV. So we did. I was in Canada, I'm Canadian, and I often actually make my students watch the presidential address after 9/11 as a way to help them understand the role that emotion plays in international relations. We often think of it as kind of, very sort of dispassionate, Machiavellian, kind of, sort of game theory-esque. But emotion plays an enormous role. And I remember even as a Canadian, I was an American, still am not, being very deeply affected by those events, and the sense of horror, the sense of anger. I try to explain to my students, when they talk about Afghanistan and Iraq and kind of the received wisdom 25 years on of where this has gone. And I try to tell them, you need to understand the emotion of where people were. We all lost our minds for a couple of months. And this is not an uncommon circumstance, actually, in politics. And I wanted to dig into that to understand, okay, well, I kind of had some inkling that Christians had thought, that they'd worked systematically through Scripture in terms of its demands of justice, of righteousness, of the widow, of the poor, of the orphan, of honest weights and measures. And I'd seen that applied in kind of domestic politics. So this is what it would mean for, thinking about your senatorial race or something like that, right? Especially in the United States. But there was really almost nothing in the world of international relations. And a lot of it was just kind of, sort of derivative of a kind of pragmatism that's like, well, we do kind of how we think about Christian politics here inside of the kind of sovereign state in which we live. And out there, oh man, there's crazy stuff out there. So what do you got to do? You got to kind of take care of your own. And I counted that very quickly with my students. When we would, for example, talk about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States of America in August of 1945, they would usually say, well, it's not what you would want to do, but you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Sometimes this is what it takes in order to achieve the outcomes that you're looking for. And I was fascinated by that because, that's an interesting argument, but it's basically not a religious one, right? I mean, it's not a Jewish one, it's not a Muslim one, it's not a Christian one. It's just pragmatism. Sometimes you got to do some bad things, and maybe they'd watched a lot of Jack Bauer or something, some 24, and realized, sometimes you got to torture some bad guys to find out where the bomb is, and that's what you got to do. And I realized that in the post 9/11 world, we needed a way to think scripturally, not just about honest weights and measures inside of our countries, but what does it look like to have honest weights and measures with and between other countries? What does it look like to think about justice with and between other states and other political communities, and also how to think about justice inside of other political communities? This was clearly a post 9/11 question that emerged as well. Well, what responsibility do you have? Is it the Pottery Barn rule? You break it, you bought it. What is your responsibility inside of Afghanistan, inside of Iraq, when there are genocides, when it's not in your country? And it's not immediately proximate. And yet there is clearly a sense that the Bible speaks to in a kind of perennial and eternal way that the God of justice, the God of the universe, calls to account these things. And so I said, look, we've got to find a way to talk about this. So I was not the first one. In a lot of ways, the book sort of tries to mine the Christian social and political and theological tradition and kind of point out where we could go. But I think it's actually the first book that's done this since basically the 1980s, since the heart of the Reagan administration. So maybe it was time, and that's what I hope readers kind of come to and come away with.
Yeah, and it's called, the subtitle is A Christian Introduction, but you're doing this within a specific tradition, and you're very self-aware of that tradition. You mention it often. It's sort of the Augustine, Calvin, Kuyper trajectory there.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear from you then. What are the unique things of that perspective that come to bear on this topic?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I do try to be sort of to show my sources, my footnotes, as it were. I've had people say to me, "Oh, well, I read this, and it seems Wesleyan to me, or it seems Catholic to me, or it reads Pentecostal to me." I actually talk about the Pentecostal politics of sort of Pentecost and so on. And I said, well, that's great, because insofar as Kuyper and Calvin and Augustine are reading Scripture, we would hope that they're bearing witness to the truth of that, right? It's not, if Calvin is innovating something that is independent of Scripture, well, then actually we might have some problems. So you would expect, as it were, a sort of promiscuous ecumenicity, that we're sort of reading off of each other's notes, and you would find those resonances. That said, I think you're right. In terms of the tradition I know best, in terms of the one that I lean on, yes, it is Augustine as inherited through Calvin, as sort of comes to us through Kuyper, Bavinck, some of the kind of Neo-Calvinists. And really, I think the fundamental insight that they bring, and this is certainly how sort of Neo-Calvinism would sort of explain it, is that grace restores nature. This is the kind of sort of Wienhoff sort of summary of what we mean by Neo-Calvinism, which is, God has created a good world that was bristling with potential and capacity. He has gifted human beings with power, including political power, to name the animals, to rule, to subdue, to do all of these wonderful things. Sin has tremendously disrupted that, right? And yet, we have been tasked by this Creator God, who comes still to redeem not only us in our disobedience, but the whole of our regency, right, to work among those ruins. This is a very kind of Augustinian sentiment. And that's where we find ourselves today, right, in a world that is created good, that is fallen, that is, as the Calvinists say, totally depraved, not by which we mean as bad as it could possibly be, but simply that there is no thing that is untouched by that sin, including ourselves, by the way, which immediately orients us toward a kind of political humility, toward a kind of a sort of posture, I think. And yet also Christ has come to make all things new. Not us making it new. That's very important. As I often tell my students, a little bit of Calvinism is a terribly dangerous thing, right? Well, because it'll tell you Christ is king, right? But it might not tell you we are not. And that's very important. The Christ is king, and we are co-laborers, but we are also waiting, right? Because we cannot fix even ourselves. And so God forbid that we imagine we could fix something as sort of trenchant, something as difficult as the injustices that miscarry in international relations. Proximate, yes, that's the Augustinian insight, right? And yet always waiting in the here and now. And so I lean on those voices, but yeah, I've studied the Catholic social tradition. I love the encyclicals. You're going to find lots of Catholic social thought in here. You're going to see Jacques Maritain. You're going to see, Rerum Novarum, Gaudium et Spes, Laborem Exercens, Caritas in Veritate, all of these different encyclicals in the tradition that I think are rich and beautiful. But I think you're right to sort of know, yeah, it sort of comes by way of that sort of more Calvinistic tradition.
So, I also have my copy, of your book
good.
here.
Yeah.
I thought it was fantastic. And even as you're kind of teasing out some of these things, I'm hearing Skillen's The Good of Politics,
100%.
Kuyper's, Political Visions and Illusions, you name him. And so, those are fantastic works. They're on my shelf behind me.
Yeah,
I would add your book to the trinity, if you will.
That's very high praise. Yeah.
There you go. It is excellent, and exactly what for the reason that you just named. You've essentially crammed like a degree's worth of material into this book in a very accessible fashion, and so it's going to expose readers to, even if you're not swimming in that stream, it's going to expose you to the issues that need to be addressed and that Christians ultimately need to have an answer for. And so I really appreciate what you're doing there. I did want to ask one question, though, about the tradition, because Koisis, introduces readers to the Catholic, I think it was, the social subsidiarity, and then the Neo-Calvinist sphere sovereignty.
Yeah.
And I think you took a sphere sovereignty track.
Yeah.
In your thinking. But one of the things that comes out in your book is just how interrelated political theory and economic theory are.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to hear you kind of interact with sphere sovereignty in these two hyper interrelated things.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting because, of course, Kuyper is articulating this idea of sphere sovereignty, and George Harink actually has some wonderful history that says, well, where did he get this idea? Did it all come from the Germans and so on? But he's articulating this idea at the end of the 19th century, right? And this is actually a moment, if you go back and you read people like John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy, which is seen as a treatise actually in modern politics, the separation of politics from economics as sort of discrete and sort of, separable fields is really a kind of late modern thing. Now, that's not to say it's not useful, and there's lots of different reasons that you might do it. But it is to say that in particular, when I read scripture, and I go back and I see, these are the demands that, for example, Torah has on the people of God in terms of how they, what I see is that power, it's not always so easy, actually, when you're going through the kind of, the commands for the God's people to understand, well, this is the part of it that's political power, and this is the part of it that's economic power. Actually, it sort of feels like, well, they're kind of intertwined in a way. Like the joke I always start when I teach international political economy with my students is the thing about political economy is there's no other kind. Right? There's no such thing as, and by the way, Adam Smith thought this too, because we all go back, it's the anniversary of Adam Smith. I know you Americans are having a big one this year too, but so is Adam Smith. And, he writes in his, A Wealth of Nations, about a huge sort of moral substructure that's necessary to kind of make these ideas of supply and demand and kind of self-interested economics kind of work. And he actually articulates those first in his book in 1759, Theory of Moral Sentiments, right? Where he had a chair of moral philosophy, actually, before he becomes known as the father of sort of economics. The point being that I actually think Scripture and Adam Smith are right. That there's no such thing as a kind of picture of the distribution of political power that does not also imply a picture of how economic goods should also be distributed along the way. I think that's the witness that Scripture gives us. That's the witness of most political and economic thinking, such as they were for most of human history. And we really kind of only separate them out for discrete inquiry, kind of, I think, actually around the time that Kuyper is writing it into the 20th century.
Okay.
It's one of the things I mentioned in Koisis' book where he treats liberalism. And by the way, you can see, in my book, there are homages to David Koisis and Political Visions and Illusions. And when I started college in September of 2001, it was reading a draft of Political Visions and Illusions of David Koisis' book, where I learned all this from him, So I've been in this literature for a long time. But when I read that, I mean, he treats liberalism, the one sort of tweak that I sort of make to his argument is I say, well, really, when we go abroad, when we're thinking in terms of international relations, it actually often doesn't help to think of liberal internationalism as a purely political tradition. It's really a tradition of it's really a tradition of political economy. And actually, I think that's true also of domestic politics. To think of just liberalism as a political tradition, I actually think it's a tradition of political economy, because can you have a tradition of kind of, individual rights and the rule of law and all of these things we associate with liberalism and also not have private property? Could you have a completely state-owned collectivist system that also honors, individual rights? And some of these things, it's like, well, maybe in the abstraction you could, but I haven't seen any examples in history where that happens. These things typically go together in terms of the way that they organize political and economic power. And so, yeah, I do think sort of a little bit contra coesis that is
Okay.
actually a slightly different way to think about the tradition.
So now I am in complete agreement with you, and I'm very happy to hear you say that. Now, I've pushed back on other neo-Calvinists that are going to double down on sphere sovereignty by saying when you look at Torah, you get clan history, you get household codes, you get economic treatise, you get political. On and on and on. Prophetic lodestone. You get all these things integrated into this single document.
Yeah.
And the pushback that I'll receive from the sphere sovereignty folks is that was for a particular people in a particular time, and we are not there anymore. Do you buy that argument?
Yeah, so I buy part of that argument. But parceled into the kind of doctrine of subsidiarity, or this idea, is a kind of differentiation, that there's an increasing differentiation in human societal spheres. I think that's broadly speaking, empirically true. I mean, you just kind of look historically and you say, yeah, you know what, they didn't have a lot of curling clubs, in Jerusalem back then. But as you get into cold weather and as you get a sort of, greater differentiation in society, you have greater sort of, the Neo-Calvinists say societal pluriformity. Forgive me, the way it comes over from the Dutch. What can one do? Greater societal pluriformity. And that's true. And so you have an increase in kind of institutions, and actually the sphere sovereigntists, the Kuyperians would say that's actually right there in creation. We see that, not a lot of metal workers right there, but you actually do see them, metal workers and musicians, emerge over the book of Genesis, and city builders. This is a differentiation. Electricians, again, not a strong demand for electricians, in the time of the Torah. But, now, of course, this is, bread and butter. We would expect such things. So that part of the argument, I think, is true. It's also one of the things that makes sphere sovereignty dynamic, right? Because, it is not as though the potentialities in creation stopped unfolding sometime in the 19th century when Kuyper articulated this. Actually, what we see is that increasingly there are all kinds of interesting areas where we need new institutions and new ways of thinking about what norms govern them. For example, there's a lot of concern about so-called artificial intelligence. This was not a problem that the post-war order had to deal with in 1945. There's a lot of concern about how to govern near-Earth orbit. There's a lot of stuff going on up there right now. Can we weaponize it? Should we weaponize it? By the way, the short answer, the quick answer is no. We should definitely not weaponize it. But we need answers to these questions in terms of, well, who governs near-Earth orbit? Where does the sovereignty of states begin and end in terms of the altitude ceiling? All of these things are new questions. Right? The ancient Israelites didn't need them. Heck, the Eisenhower administration didn't need them, but we do. And so I think that part of sphere sovereignty is helpful and true. But where I think sometimes, the Kuyperians get maybe a little bit too stultified, where they kind of lock in on, well, in the early 20th century in the Netherlands, these were the spheres, and these are the ones we have today. And it's like, well, some of them, clearly, there's a continuity, there's a kind of, but some of them actually are dynamic and they shift and they change. And how you would think about those demands is different today than it was back then. And so I think you need something like sphere sovereignty, you need something like subsidiarity to understand how is the authority of the king mediated to his stewards, and how ought they to mediate it in turn to the different areas of human life that do indeed emerge, that are indeed organic and dynamic, as we see kind of in the creation sort of account. We do need some kind of account like that. And subsidiarity is helpful. By the way, I don't actually turn my back on that, even though I probably mention it less in the book. But I think sphere sovereignty is probably one of the more helpful political accounts to help us think through that. It does give us a bit of a picture, as I think you were complaining about, of why these norms, why these institutions would have been arranged in the way that they were in the time that they were, right? I think when I see in Torah, when I see those laws being given, this is the way Herman Bavinck talks about it. Jesus does a similar thing. Jesus is the law restorer, as Herman Bavinck says. And so when he gives his Sermon on the Mount, it is not, now here's the Sermon on the Mount and it's a new law and you won't have heard anything like this. No. In fact, what he's saying is, this is the law you have always heard, but this is how you ought to live it in this place, in this time where you are. And so it is up to us to also hear the law and understand what is the way that we ought to live, given the demands. The creator of the universe has gifted us a cheat sheet to how this place is supposed to work. So, how ought we to work within those demands? And there, I think spirit sovereignty is helpful, but also dynamic and organic. Yeah, it shifts, it changes, it develops, as does human civilization and human institutions.
And you do a really good job, I thought, of teasing out the organic nature of these things. When the modernist mind is looking for just clear cut, give me the hard and fast, all that. But I do want to go a little bit into this. Torah gives us the cheat sheet because, again, I agree with you. Now, I am curious. This is an observation, not a criticism. But I feel like in the former prophets and the latter prophets, you would have ample material to work from on the topic of international politics.
100%, yeah.
But and it could have been left on the cutting room floor as you were putting this book together. But I didn't see a whole lot of resourcing your thought in that material. Talk a little bit about that for me.
Yeah. Some of it was on the cutting floor. You're absolutely right. I mean, I open, the chapter on realism opens with a dialogue with Sennacherib, right? And in Assyria. And I think, often international relations sort of starts with Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian Wars. And there's this one little line from the Melian dialogue that says, actually, your Stephen Miller said it at the White House recently. The strong will do what they can. The weak will suffer what they must. And I think, I said, well, actually, if I were a Christian, I would go to the dialogue, with Assyria much more dramatically. This, I think, is actually a picture of it. When I started my PhD with Scott Thomas in 2013, the first thing he had me do, which by the way I think is really weird, is he said, you know what, you should go back. It's great to meet, blah blah. You should go back. You should read the book of Isaiah. And you should come back to me and help me understand what is Isaiah's vision for human security and geopolitics. And, Scott and I had a wonderful, rich dialogue about that. And actually, his book is footnoted because he did do a book on Isaiah's vision for human security. And he's got a number of other smaller articles about that. And I tried to work some of that through. Admittedly, some of it got cut out. But I think one of the things that the prophets, I think, bear the strongest witness to, and so it probably comes out the most in this chapter, is the chapter on realism. And that's where, because constantly, we are looking for, the sources of human security and power, the horses, the chariots, the treasury, the interdynastic marriages, and actually the book of Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 17, specifically lays out in terms of, basically you'll have a king, but he won't get to do any of the kingly things, that you're accustomed to. And it's sort of specifically cutting off at the knees, as it were, the idolatries of human security that we so easily turn to. Tim Keller used to talk about, the big three, and I'm a simple boy who was born on a farm, so that's good enough for me. Sex, power, money. Those are the ones that we go to, and we go to them because, by the way, this is the kind of Neo-Calvinist insight. They're actually so good, right? I mean, do I really need to talk about how good sex is? It's how we all at some point got here, but also power and money. They're actually profound gifts, right? That we either image in our capacity or have been gifted to us, that we have sort of innately. And yet, as Kuyper liked to say, the best corrupted becomes the worst. And I think, that has a very kind of prophetic edge to it. And that's where I think, when you're resting on one of those sort of, idols of human accomplishment, of identity, of power, of purpose, that's where the prophets, I think, speak most directly to the often sort of Machiavellian kind of material secularity of kind of, realism and neo-realism. And the prophets say, this is what you see. like the servant of Elisha, right? You look out on the hillside, you say, well, there are the armies, they are arrayed against us. And he says, well, actually uncover their eyes and let my servants see that the chariots of the Lord are aflame and all around. And always, I think, particularly as Christians thinking about politics, we are in danger of trusting, as it were, in, the strong arm of the bow and the chariots and the horses. And I don't mean to be naive. Those things are important. They are not immaterial. There are still fighting men in Israel, but what I do want to do is I want to create a kind of prophetic context within which to understand the witness about those things. And so I think you're right. The prophets don't show up as much as they could. But I only got one chapter on scripture and international relations. So I got a little bit of Isaiah in there. I got, some of 1st and 2nd Kings. But I would love to dive deeper into that. I think that's a totally fair point, and I think would be a really, really rich point of departure. Certainly my old doctoral supervisor, Scott Thomas, would think so.
Yeah, well, just consider it for your sequel. And so we had on, not once but twice, real recently, Yoram Hazony, Virtue of Nationalism, talking about the anniversary of his book on nationalism and how it is a virtue. He does a couple of things in that book that at least are tangential, if not immediately relevant to what you've done here in international politics. But one of those things is that he contrasts the nation with empire, and this idea that empire, is taking over other nations. And so, as you're writing on international politics, what do you see in this? You use the phrase covenantal pluralism.
Yes.
So, are you then agreeing with him? Empire bad? Just talk a little bit more about this.
Well, it's always hard. Now, would you say empire is bad? It's kind of like one of those questions like, now, sir, when did you stop beating your wife? It's like, well,
Right. Okay.
So generally speaking, no, I'm not in favor of empire. That said, I don't love the terms that Hazony leaves us with.
Okay.
And actually, this is where the Augustinian intervention is, I think, the most important. So I don't love, nation, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I definitely don't love empire. I like the Augustine framing of commonwealth. Okay. And here are some of the recoveries. So let me do the Canadian thing. I'm going to say a lot of what I think are really helpful and constructive things first. And then,
Okay.
and then I'm going to apologize for criticisms after.
Sorry.
I think, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So what I think is really helpful, one of the things that Hazony sort of recovers, and I think this is over and against the kind of more materialist, secularist kind of liberalism that he has in mind, that is particularly, I think is occasionally parodied, but I think also sort of exists to some degree in his book, the way he talks about it. I want to talk about a recovery of religion, culture, and language, as constitutive on some level of a kind of national identity. Okay. Now, this is not a new idea. Samuel P. Huntington talked about this in his book, A Clash of Civilizations, right? It was an article in 1993, a book in 1995. It was contra Francis Fukuyama's, The Last Man, et cetera, et cetera. So those of you who know these debates. So there was this argument that goes back a pace. And of course, Huntington borrowed it from the Catholic historian Christopher Dawson. Dawson was making a kind of anti-secularist argument too. He said, we've all absorbed this kind of pagan secular philosophy of history. We all believe that, for example, the great civilizations of the world produced the great religions of the world. That was all one big race for calories is our kind of historiography. And that basically then the Big Mac is basically the kind of crowning achievement of civilization. We put so many calories in such a package. This is the crowning achievement. But Dawson says, actually, that historiography is completely wrong. In the reverse. It is not the great civilizations of the world that produce the great religions, but it is the great religions that produce the great civilizations, right? And he says, now go around and look at the world and its architecture, right? And the ancient world, and tell me that it was not, in fact, this kind of primordial, the Dooyeweerdians would say, ground motive, the religious ground motive, right?
Good.
It is not in some way the restlessness of our hearts, to put it in a more Augustinian way, that actually helps define, the boundaries of the context of a commonwealth, of a community. It does. What were the pyramids of Giza? Were these aluminum smelting factories? No. These were as best as we can tell, projects of divinity of some form, right? And in the ancient world, you go all over the place and you see these monuments. These are projects of what? Public works, was this, the Eisenhower interstate system? Well, there were roads. The Romans did do those. But generally speaking, actually, I mean, these are phenomenal achievements that actually rise out of, I think, this kernel Augustinian insight that our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. We're searching after the divine, about who God is. And so I think Hazony is right to recover those things. Those are an intrinsic part. But here's where I disagree with him. And when I think this is a very important disagreement, that you can have, particularly in a Pentecostal world, so this gets into kind of my reading of it, you can have a proximate politics, the way that Augustine describes it, that you can have commonwealths committed to proximate goods, right? But they do not need to be, or they must not necessarily all be, enjoined by ultimate goods, right? Jacques Maritain, the very famous Catholic political philosopher, put it this way on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights: we all agree on these rights, provided nobody asks us why.
Right. Yeah.
And this was his very sort of pithy thing. Now, by the way, Maritain was a Catholic, and so if you go on and read him, he'll make it very clear. I don't know how the Protestants get here. Their theology is a mess. But the Catholic way, the Buddhists, the Muslims, he said, I don't think it works for them. They say it does, but I don't think so. The way to get here is with Catholic social dogma. Well, of course, Maritain would say that. He's a Catholic, and if he said otherwise, that would be kind of weird. And I'm a Calvinist, and I'll say that about Calvinism too. I think that's the kind of best way to get there. But the point is that I think what Hazony is confusing, and I say this generously, but also I think there is a danger to it, is he is saying that political communities in today's day and age must be enjoined by ultimacy, right? And I actually think one of the geniuses of the modern political order, and by the way, I think this is the genius, this being the 250th anniversary, one of the geniuses of the American political order, is that it creates the conditions in which there is at least some optionality politically. I'm not trying to sell you a worldview here. I'm trying to sell you a politics, okay? That's very important, because I think Hazony makes this argument that, well, if you have this politics, it necessarily produces this kind of worldview. And I don't think that has to be the case. You can have a political view, and it's sort of, how should we say, intrinsic to that sphere, to use that Kuyperian language.
Okay.
So you can be committed, as Augustine would say, to proximate loves. Now, how would we know what those are? Well, I've got great news for you, especially if you're an American. They wrote them all down. Right? Go and read your Declaration of Independence. Go and read your Constitution and study the way that your political institutions have been set up. And what you will find is you will not find the Westminster Catechism. You will not find the Canons of Dort or the Belgic Confession. But what you will find is a political constitution, the content of which, if I am an atheist, or I'm a Muslim, or I'm a Hindu, or I'm a Calvinist, or I am a Catholic, I could actually come behind and say, these are proximate political goods. I am committed to these things, and I am as committed to them, by the way, as my Hindu, Muslim, Baha'i neighbor is, right? But they have them for their own particular reasons. The concern that the nationalists have, and I don't disagree with their concern, I just think the only way to resolve this is to do something very dangerous politically, right? The concern that they have is that is unstable, that we need to trust those little platoons, as Burke would call them, those little communities of coming up with their own indigenous religious rationale for supporting, the Declaration, the Constitution, all the different elements of what we would call American political order, the hierarchy of loves that sort of define the American political community and political experiment. But my argument would be, actually, it's gone pretty well. And we've seen it work. We've seen Muslims and Baha'is and Jews. So this is an empirical assessment, right? So you tell me, oh, well, I'm not sure that we can trust them. I don't know. I think we could. For a while, by the way, in the middle of the 20th century, Americans were pretty sure we couldn't trust Catholics. It was a whole thing with Kennedy, right? Now, are we sure? Are we sure that we can have a Catholic president? He's going to be out. He's going to be taking orders from the Pope. At least nobody's worried today's vice president is going to be taking orders from the Pope. There's this idea in which, can we trust their political theology? And of course, actually, and it did take the Catholics a while, by the way. I don't mean to overstate this. The Ultramontanism, the Gallican controversy, the early 20th century, Vatican II. But eventually, actually, there are really robust, substantive, distinctively Catholic theological reasons for supporting something like a limited, liberal, democratic, capitalist order. And so I worry that with the Hazoni's of the world, they're anxious. And so they say, no, you've got to have a unity of religion, language, and culture. That's what gives identity to the nation. That's how they should go in the world. They shouldn't try to export that. It's indigenous to them. It's indigenous to themselves. I worry about the argument of indigeneity. Right? Now, I come from Canada. We talk about indigeneity a lot, right? I don't think you talk about it so much here in the United States. But if you go into, for example, the Middle East, which you'll know well, they talk about indigeneity a lot.
Sure.
Right? And that's not, scoring points in the faculty lounge, right? That's life and death. And by the way, it is in India too now, with Narendra Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party, right? The BJP. Certain religions are indigenous. They are Vedic. Right? But by the way, Christianity and Islam are not. The Russian Orthodox Church and our Patriarch Kirill and President Putin's version of the Ruski Mir, right? This also has religion, language, and culture, right? And certain things are not indigenous, right? Well, guess what those are, right? And actually, increasingly, this is Xi Jinping's nationalism as well. He's rediscovered religion, actually, which is a funny thing for a Marxist to do, but I'm not sure how good of a Marxist he is. But he's rediscovered Taoism and Buddhism and Confucianism. I watched a children's cartoon that included, a somewhat tubby-looking Karl Marx and a tubby-looking Confucius hugging it out as the long-lost friends that they were, as the origin of the genius of Chinese civilization. I think, it's funny, because actually in the Cultural Revolution, they weren't actually very hot on Chinese history and civilization and religion. They actually purged it all. In fact, one of the reasons that they're so hot on the reclamation of Taiwan is it happens to be where a lot of the history of mainland China was, because it's where the Nationalist Party fled with all of the treasures of the imperial regime, which were eviscerated in mainland China. So a lot of their identity is locked up in there because they burned it all to the ground on the mainland. What's my point? My point is, Hazony has a recovery of some of these concepts that I think is important, right? We've been too footloose, too secular, too materialist in imagining, the government is just a kind of, it's like a contract with the telephone company. This is the way that Alistair McIntyre talked about it, killing for the telephone company. It's not a telephone company. It is, in fact, in the ordering of our loves, as Augustine would have it. Nation, family, hearth, home, these are substantive, serious things. They are related to things like the history of religion, of language, of culture. And yet, some of the best, the most productive, dare I use the word just, in like a very Torah sense of the term, civilizations and states, I think have been open on the basis of inviting others in to see those proximate goods and articulate their own individual, ultimate indigenous rationale for why they are so substantive. And that's why I like Commonwealth. Empire, it enforces from top down. Commonwealths see a set of goods. This is very C.S. Lewis, The Four Loves kind of thing, and he's getting it from Augustine too, right? They see a set of goods and say, do you see them too? Right? And this is, by the way, this is one of the things I think this administration sometimes gets a little backwards. This is the reason why so much of the world envied the United States of America and was and wanted to be its best friend, right? All the United States was powerful. All the United States is rich. Those things are both true. But the power and the wealth are derivative of something else, right? They're derivative, in my opinion, of having a comparatively better ordering of loves, seeing a way of living that seems to be. Now, look, I don't want to go all baptized, and idealistic here. Let me say, as Churchill would, it's an abomination. It's rife with idolatries. All of those things are true. And yet, it's the best thing we have, or it's the worst thing we have except for all the others, So that's what they envy. That's what they envy. As I sometimes remind my friends in Washington, the Germans, after 1945, you've had the Germans at your feet for 80 years. And Kissinger used to make the joke, the Germans, they're either at your feet or at your throat. Well, why were they at your feet? Because They envied the American experience. They envied the American experiment, right? Its robustness, its sense of self, of identity, of morality, and yes, all of its fights and fissures and all of these things. But it was welcomed into it as a Commonwealth would, not imperially, not impressed upon it, right? But actually, we opted in. Why do the Canadians? We love a little bit of light anti-Americanism. Of course we do. It's part of our national identity. And yet, the Americans are also our best friends. Why? Is it because you've oppressed us so much that we have to? No. It's because actually, if you go and you look at the Canadian Constitution, you look at our Bill of Rights and later our Charter of Rights in 1982, one of the things you're going to find is that Canadians and Americans are different, but boy, in some really fundamental political ways that matter an awful lot, we are the same. Right. And that to me is so important. And that's the piece that I think Hazony misses by not sort of, eliciting some of that more Augustinian language. It's either empire or nation. It's nations that are on their own individual linguistic and religious and historical terms, or empires that are oppressing their views. But that's not the view of history we've had for the last 80 years. It's actually been quite different, not imperially imposed, but invited into. And very much to the benefit, I have to say.
So just totally throw it out there. It's clear that you love the words proximate and penultimate. And so I would recommend it as the name of your 4-piece band. Certainly as we talk about politics, these are not themselves ultimate goods.
Yes.
So I understand that you're trying to emphasize that. But as you've articulated, kind of your vision for what politics is aimed at in general, if I could summarize, and I'm curious to hear if I've done so well, you would say that it is, how was I going to say it? Justice rooted in love. And so my question then is, are there definitions of those words that are not religious?
Yeah, right. No, so I would actually say that justice is the right ordering of loves, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So that's how I would put it. That's a very Augustinian way to put it, right? Which is another way of noting, by the way, that there are disordered loves, but just the idols themselves are not, it's not somehow in and of itself evil, but it's actually the ordering of how human hearts have attached themselves to it that has created disordered affection, disordered loves. So other non-religious meanings to that, no. I don't think so. When we talk about justice as right relations, right? What we mean by right relations, I don't think there are sort of, abstract, non-religious sort of answers to those questions. And so I think religion, so if you're saying, isn't religion therefore important to a political society? Oh yeah, it's fundamental. Remember, Dawson says that the great religions produced the great civilizations. And I have no problem, by the way, saying, as many people do, that, Christianity played an enormously important and even fundamental role in the American experiment, Eric Nielsen's The Hebrew Republic, stuff like this. I got no problem with that, right? The question that I have is, so all that I think is, as a matter of empirical historical record, true. That's what people were dealing with. That's what they were thinking about. By the way, it's the same, if you go into the Vedic subcontinent and you talk about Ashoka and his rock edicts, and the articulation of what we would call freedom of religion or belief within the Vedic tradition, what we would call the Hindu tradition. Wasn't that a Vedic articulation that sort of comes into the new Indian state, Nehru and sort of yeah, it is. I mean, it comes from a Hindu source, but no problem. You can have Islamic conceptions, no compulsion of religion and these things as well. Sure, absolutely. You would have that. So there's a kind of historical recognition that I think is true, that you have these religious, ideas that give fuel, that sort of articulate these sort of more proximate, penultimate, my band name terms. The question that I have for Hazony and the kind of nationalists and otherwise then is to say, but does it always therefore have to be that religion, that specific religion, that fuels those ideas, right? That fuels those proximate political ideas. And I've already given one example where Hindus have done that, right? I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an example where actually a lot of different religious traditions did that, right? So I think the genius of the American political experiment is it does have that origin, that history, that founding, but that it is promiscuous in its invitation to say, well, come on down. If you can join this American experiment and agree with these basic values of the Declaration of the Constitution, and you can do that for your own internal rationale that aren't Christian, right, that aren't, religious in the way that we would typically think about it, then you can be here too. This was what Reagan described as the genius of America. He said, you can go to Germany, you'll never be German. You can go to Japan, you'll never be Japanese, but you can come to the United States of America and you can be American, right? And that is, I think, what is so attractive about the United States. And I think that's the challenge to Hazony, because I think Hazony's nationalism wants to say Reagan was wrong about that, right? That there has to be a kind of Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. Look, I'm Paul. I'm the Jew to the Jews here. I'm as Anglo-Saxon and Protestant as they come. But
Sure.
I'm saying, look, I think the genius, I think to give up on that genius is to actually relent into a much more coercive, into a much more imperial, ironically, and into a much less just society. It imagines that the king, as it were, that King David, that his throne is now the presidency. But actually, in my world, King David's throne is Jesus, right? And the president, to use Tolkien-esque language, or, I don't want to overstate the presidency and the executive branch, the government of the United States in its totality and its governmental authority, right, is a steward. And it is not for the steward to deny, as it were, the return of the king. He will come and make all things new. We do proximate justice here and now. Yeah.
So I'm curious then, in that this benefit that America enjoys that Germany and Japan and others do not, do you see a moral deficiency in their cultural expression of government, we'll say?
In Japan and Germany's cultural
Yeah,
expression.
just the examples that you gave there, where you'll never be German, but here you'll be American.
Yeah. Well, I think it speaks to, there's an American dream in a way in which I think it's harder to point to the Japanese dream. Look, I lived in Japan. I love Japan. It's a beautiful place. Don't get me wrong. I lived in Japan for a year. I enjoyed it very much. The school children chased me through the street and said, "Gaijin, Gaijin, Gaijin." This is very normal. I'm a very large white guy. I look a little out of place in Osaka. Even more so in the town and village where I lived. So I think, there's a dynamism both economically and politically in the United States of America that I think other more linguistically, ethnically, and religiously bound political economies lack. And of course, by the way, especially in some of the East Asian and European contexts, the religious element has kind of evaporated, right? We experienced this in Canada too with the Quiet Revolution, where there was a very French, very Catholic province in Quebec. And then after the 1960s, it was just very French, right? And the question is, well, is the French language enough to hang a civilization on? It's a lovely language, don't get me wrong. I grew up French immersion. I appreciate it very much. Everything here in Michigan basically has a French name, even though they'll all deny it. But is it enough? If Huntington's, religion, language, and culture, are the kind of cornerstones, and you lose religion, and you kind of lose culture, and what you got is language. You kind of end up with, my friend Tobias Kremner, he goes to a bunch of, he studies, nationalist movements in Germany and France, the AfD and so on. And he says, where you've got German nationalists singing Silent Night, Stille Nacht, but they say, oh, they don't believe in the virgin birth. They're not particularly religious. It's a German cultural song, right? And I think, no, it's not. And that's not. So there is, as it were, a kind of rediscovery. Well, what is German identity? What is French identity? What is Swedish identity? What is Dutch identity? What is Canadian identity? These are questions that we're all asking because we all leaned on a certain kind of privileged ethnicity and religion to give meaning to that. What's great about the United States, what's dynamic about it actually is it specifically said, right, yeah, we have a history. Yeah, we have a culture. Sure, Christianity is a big part of, the history of the United States of America. No question. You'll see it everywhere. It's very dynamic. Tocqueville talked about it, right? That's an anniversary, too, of democracy in America. All of that is true, but you don't have to be, right? You could be something different. In fact, we're excited to see what you could make of it. And I think that, honestly, that explains economic productivity. That explains political power. It explains the American dream. that people want to come here. They want to be friends with it. They want to emulate it. That there are these aspects of it that I think, and the reason why it works, bringing us right Torah back full circle, is because that ordering, I think, there's a kind of Pentecostal politics to it. There's a rightly ordered proximate nature to the way that the American experiment has done it. And other countries are struggling toward some version of that, but it's hard because in some cases they have a lot more history, and it was a lot more very specifically religious and ethnic, right? Especially in East Asia, this is true. By the way, we often, to go there and imagine that you'll be Korean or be Japanese if you're not these things. Good luck. Well, their economies are in a lot of trouble because guess what? They're not having enough babies and they're in demographic freefall. And so is the United States of America. That's true too. But I've got great news for you. As long as you don't give in to your worst xenophobic impulses, the United States of America has the best and it has the best labor in the world at its fingertips. Now, I say that somewhat self-interestedly as a Canadian sitting in America right now. But it has that because people want to come here because there is this kind of dream. And so, yeah, I do think that you do see that as an empirical, observable advantage that's intrinsic to the United States.
One final question, and then I'll let you go. So you mentioned those three things that unify, historically, I guess, the ethnicity, the language, and the religion. Peter Zeihan, I was trying to remember his name, who wrote The Accidental Superpower.
Yeah.
He adds geography to that mix. And I'm curious your thoughts on that, because you do raise these three in your book, but he would add as a significant force is geography in international politics. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think I'd probably agree with that argument. I remember reading it and thinking, oh yeah, Kaplan makes very similar arguments for the revenge of geography and so on and so forth. So the land. I mean, yeah, I think the land is enormously important, especially when it comes to identity. I mean, we have this experience in Canada. Our culture and economics in North America actually move north-south. They don't move east-west.
Right.
And so, people have often said, oh, well, you're moving to the United States. This will be a major challenge. I'm like, moving from the province of Ontario to the state of Michigan. I mean, these are Great Lakes states. The geography is exactly the same. In many ways, a lot of the culture is very, very similar. It would be a much bigger move to move from Ontario in Canada to Alberta in Canada, or British Columbia in Canada, or Newfoundland in Canada. Those are really culturally and economically, and even linguistically, different places. I can almost come off as Michigan, in some of my accents. So I do think that land is an important and a constitutive component. I mean, this is clearly going to be the case much more so even in Europe, definitely in the Middle East, and certainly in East Asia as well. And I know this is sort of part of Hazony's argument too. The problem with an argument about geography, if it gets paired with some of those other arguments about religion, language, and ethnicity, is that what you end up with an argument about land that is exclusive for a particular group of people, right? And I do think there's something about the land in the United States of America that is intrinsic to its identity, its oceans, its particularly protected buffer, the sort of fledgling little Canada to the north, most of Mexico that you took in 1848 to the south. There is something sort of distinctive about the United States of America that feeds into its history and its geography in that way. But I think the genius, again, of the United States of America is that while that land is an intrinsic part of its identity, it's not exclusive in either its ethnic, religious, or linguistic, right? I seem to recall there's a lot of people who speak Spanish in the United States of America. That's not really how it started in 1776, right? But it's where it went. And actually, our son, who, by the way, is a very plump little Dutch boy who did French in Canada, is doing Spanish immersion here in Michigan this September, right? Why? Because, this is the country that it lives in now. And also language is fundamental to human brain development and so on. But I mean, this is the argument. And so the land argument to me is very important. I concede it. But I want to be very careful on how it pairs to those other identity characteristics, because then all of a sudden, we end up with Modi and the BJP somewhere in, the Indian subcontinent. And we say, well, actually, this village is not for Christians. And it's not for people of this color or this identity. And I think the genius of America is that it says, well, actually, the land it's promiscuously, as it were, available, right? Provided that there is a kind of creedal commitment to some of these more proximate things. right? And there's something about that. It creates a more proper ordering of land within that ordering of loves, right? Where it doesn't subject it to more sort of imperialistic or nationalistic exclusivism, but actually invites it not in an unlimited way. I'm not trying to be a naive idealist and saying, look, open borders, everybody can be American, right? No, there are real things that the United States of America believes. There are real values that it holds. And there are people in the world who do not think those things and do not believe those things and are not ready to be American, and never want to be because maybe they hate those things, right? That's okay. Right. But there is, at least in principle, that opportunity. And I think that sort of puts land in the mix, but within a rightly ordered sort of Augustinian framework.
Thank you so much for allowing me to pepper you with questions here. The new book is, I don't know if maybe my thing is too blurry there.
Yeah.
You've got it there.
There we go.
Christ and Covenant in Global Politics. Again, I would throw it out there as part of the big three that should be on the shelf for somebody who's interested in the topic of politics. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, such a pleasure. Thanks, Mike. Yeah.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.